Hey everybody, and welcome to our webinar. Today we're going to combine the results from our 20,000 plus person survey of transit riders with some advice for the new Biden administration that flows from these results. Our goal is that you're going to end up more informed on how both transit riders as well as policymakers in DC are handling the pandemic and what to expect over the coming months. So as way of introduction, I'm David Block-Schachter. I'm the Chief Business Officer at Transit, the leading journey planning application in North America. I'm joined by Emily Gates on my left. Emily is on the partnerships team here at Transit after a long and storied career in bike sharing. And on my right, we've got Andrew Salzberg, Head of Policy at Transit after a distinguished career with Uber and the World Bank. So over the next 20 to 30 minutes in record time, we're going to go through the data that we've collected. We've also got some more written materials, which we'll follow up with after the webinar, as well as sending out a video of the next hour to everyone as a follow-up. As a personal note, I like to go walk outside while I'm listening to webinars, so I hope some of you have taken the opportunity to get up from your computers and get outside, and knowing that you won't need to take notes. It would make me very happy. So throughout the webinar, we'll start by having Andrew give some context for the discussion. Then we'll transition back to me and Emily, who will talk about the results of the survey itself. Andrew will close us out with some policy recommendations that follow from those results. Throughout, we hope that you'll ask questions, and to do so, use the Q&A function of Zoom located right there, and we'll answer them all at the end. And if we've timed this right, we'll be done with this section about 20 to 25 minutes, leaving plenty of time for questions. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Andrew to give us some policy context.
Thanks, David. I think as many of you on the call know, transit is in a tough spot. While the ridership numbers are up a little bit from the lows in March and April, they're still at a national level almost 2/3 below what they were pre-pandemic. And if you're interested, we've got a shot there of our dashboard we created alongside APTA, and you can check out how your region or your city or your agency compares to national averages if you go to transitapp.com/APTA. We'll put that link in the chat. But I think a lot of you know that, so you can dive deep on that topic. At the same time, we had inauguration last week. So there's a new administration in Washington that I think is more committed than we've seen in quite a long time to public transportation. And in particular, not just restoring what public transportation was pre-pandemic, but finding ways to build a better, stronger, more robust public transport system for the future. So that's exciting, and we have some ideas of how that might happen. But before we do that, we want to hear from transit riders themselves, so that's what the survey is for. So I'll turn it back over to David, and I'll pick it up at the end.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So, as Andrew mentioned, the decisions that the Biden team makes over the course of the next few months can alter the trajectory of transit for quite some time. New commuting patterns are going to be established in attitudes as we emerge from this pandemic. So funding essential transit services is key, but so is making sure that riders and non-riders are receiving accurate information about where the virus is spread and the safety of riding transit. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about. What we really think is important here is that the riders' voices are heard in all of this and form the foundation of policy. That's what public transit is for. So let's move on to what the riders are saying. Beginning at first principles, and uniquely because we have the resources of being used by so many users on a daily basis, we ran a survey at the end of last year. As a note here, we found that our survey respondents are generally reflective of transit ridership overall, and there's some new research from the University of Toronto on that front that I think we've just shared in the chat. This follows up on some of the other national surveys that we've run over the course of the pandemic, this back into the spring and summer. So where relevant, when I'm talking, I'm going to compare these longitudinal results to how things have changed over the pandemic. And then after the webinar is over, if you haven't had enough of us, go back and watch some of the webinars and the resources that we've created over the last 9 months, some of which are blasts from the past and some of which still feel very relevant today. So moving on to the top level stats. This survey ran just prior to Thanksgiving across our 200 plus markets in North America. You can see them there. Today, we're going to be talking about the questions in the survey, including agency satisfaction, changes in ridership perception, and safety needs. The survey was designed to be repeatable, so that we can ask substantially the same questions on a regular basis. And this will allow us to take the temperature of ridership as, fingers crossed, we emerge from the worst of the pandemic. So I'm going to be talking about US and Canadian results as a whole, but I think one of the really interesting things here is that the entire survey was designed so that we can report on agencies individually, and specifically so that agencies can benchmark themselves against their peers. We know that benchmarking isn't something that is particularly viable with most surveys. They're one-offs run by a particular agency or organization, and so we're hopeful that this is helpful to our friends in the public sector. We'll leave our email addresses, reach out to us after the meeting for more info. So I'll start us off by talking about some demographics and then turn it over to Emily for the meat. Moving to age here, we took a longitudinal view here. So when we last surveyed our full user base back in April, ridership was disproportionately young. We can see that in the intervening 6+ months, patterns have returned somewhat closer to normal. The 55+ crowd notably has returned substantially. Secondarily, we asked riders if they were riding more, the same, or less than pre-pandemic. And of those who are still riding at all, it's important to note here that we're asking people who are still opening the app. So these are the people who are at least considering using transit. And so of these folks, the 25 to 44-year age group is most likely to be riding less than they once were. Race, we see some similarities here. So the extreme racial disparity that we saw in April seems to have lessened somewhat in terms of who's riding. Nevertheless, we do find that Black and Brown people are still disproportionately represented compared to the population of pre-pandemic distributions. In a 2017 APTA report, 39% of transit riders are white, 24% Black, 19% Hispanic, as opposed to today. Also, in terms of pre-pandemic comparisons, white respondents were more likely to respond that they were riding less or not at all, while only 43% of Black respondents said the same. It was about 60% on white respondents. Big part of this comes from the fact that it's not just essential workers on transit anymore. Back in April, food and healthcare related professions made up a disproportionate percentage of those still riding. Those numbers have since dropped in a relative sense, especially among food prep and serving, as we can see there. So the sort of conclusion from the last couple of slides that I think you have to make is that while age, race, and occupation still separate those who have not yet come back to transit from those who have, it's not as extreme as it once was. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Emily to dig in a little bit more.
Thanks, David. We began in April by asking a simple question to address something that I know is on the minds of many agencies, which are how we're addressing those with accessibility needs. So in this most recent survey and in the one in April, we asked respondents if they had any difficulty, even with aids, doing specific actions: hearing, seeing, using fine motor skills, and walking. Nearly 38% of the respondents in November said they had difficulty in at least one of these categories. Before the pandemic, and we've been monitoring this for some time, a small but consistent group of transit users has had accessibility features turned into the app. And we supported that group by expanding on our wheelchair trip planner, by ensuring that we work with screen readers and other devices made for those with low visibility. Those users dropped off alongside everyone else, about 50% in April. But as of November, we're basically back to pre-pandemic levels, while our app usage continues to be, as Andrew said, something about 2/3 below what it was last January. For this population, a large percentage of current riders actually have these needs and need to be considered in how short-term policy gains or changes affect those riders as a group. In terms of the income distribution among riders, although ridership is down universally, respondents in November were closer to pre-pandemic levels of income distribution, but not by much. Each agency has been impacted by local regulations put forth by the cities and states, and the extent of the pandemic the extent of the impact of the pandemic on who is allowed to return to schools and offices based on the number of cases in the city or the state, has a large impact on who's still riding today from an income perspective. Here we show Pittsburgh riders over 3 surveys. We surveyed them in September of 2019 before the pandemic, and then again in April and November. You can see there's been almost full recovery of the middle income groups, 50,000 to 75,000 annual income, but those who make less than 40,000 a year are a higher percentage of the current ridership than they were pre-pandemic still. Other noteworthy cities to mention, as I mentioned, the income distribution varies city by city. The distribution in Chicago is much closer to pre-pandemic levels, while Washington, D.C. has not recovered nearly as much and continues to be disproportionately low income. Now we, kind of measure the competition and see what has happened to car ownership over the course of our surveys. So the percentage of car owners who responded in November is actually more than twice the percentage in April. It is up to 19% of respondents saying they own a car from 8.6 in April. The percentage of respondents who do not own a car but still have access to a car, because it's not enough to just have your name on the title. Sometimes it's just somebody nearby has provided you with access to their vehicle, is also higher in November, up to 10% in November from 5.8% in April. The pattern holds true in Los Angeles, a car heavy city, as well as New York, which is much more transit heavy. In New York, 8.1% own and 6.1% have had access in April. That is up to 17% and 11% in November. A brief reminder about our survey methodology to keep in mind while thinking about these numbers. All respondents to the survey have transit installed, and the majority of the survey respondents learned about it from an in-app banner, which means that they still have a reason to open the app. One might expect car ownership to be less robust in the November sample because they are continuing to use transit. But this is not what we're seeing in this case. Even among those who took both surveys, car ownership is higher in November. Comparatively, 12% owned in April, 12% owned today, and 10% or 7% owned in April. So we are seeing, even among those respondents who are with us longitudinally, an increase in the number of cars that people are owning. And I hope Andrew will talk more about how that changes mode shift. But from the survey responses, we see that people who own cars are more likely to report riding less. And people who do not own cars are more likely to report riding the same as before the pandemic. This relationship didn't change between the 2 surveys. 64% of November respondents say that they rely on public transit more during the pandemic. This is evidence that those who use public transit rely on it deeply. This includes essential workers, people without cars, people with accessibility needs, and people who believe in public transit. So David mentioned that we measured agency satisfaction through a number of prompts. One of the prompts was to ask riders to rate the statement, "My agency is on time and reliable," on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. Reliability, which is actually really important to transit agencies, was one of the lowest scoring on the rider satisfaction measures that we put in place, scoring an average of 3.4 out of 5. So still mildly positive, but even the highest performing agencies received a score below 4 out of 5. So very much closer to the neutral category. Smaller agencies are doing better on this front. It has to do with how agencies are communicating to riders. Transit's partners, UTA in Salt Lake City and PSTA in St. Petersburg, had the highest scores, while the MTA in New York and SEPTA have some of the lowest scores on this measure. I'd like to call attention to Baltimore, my hometown. Unfortunately for them, the timing of our survey pretty well overlapped with a major announcement in cutbacks to service. And even though they didn't end up going through with those severe cuts, the damage to rider perception of the agency's reliability may have been caused by this initial announcement that they were going to do significant cuts to service. So that may explain why it came in at the bottom of the pack. One of the other ways we were measuring satisfaction is something more universally understood across many marketing departments across industries and companies. It is referred to as the Net Promoter Score, and it's the way in which companies measure customer satisfaction by asking how likely a customer is to recommend their product or company to a friend on a scale of 1 to 10. The scale then gives negative points for people who respond lower on that scale and higher points for those who respond highly. Interestingly, it really does matter what individual agencies are doing. It's not just geographically based. For example, VTA in San Jose and Muni in San Francisco in the Bay Area are very close to one another and actually may have overlapping sets of riders, but the riders on VTA are much more likely to recommend their agency to a friend than Muni. As you can see from the scale, all of the transit agencies don't fall within that beautiful green bucket of people being, happy about the service or excited about it. I wanted to give a couple of comparative numbers, not only between agencies, but also between industries. Internet providers like Comcast typically come in around -1 Net Promoter Score, which is right about the middle of the pack when it comes to the kinds of responses we got on this measure. Health insurance companies come in at 13, which eliminates even more of the agencies on this pack. And airlines comes in at 44, blows even the best agencies on our measure out of the water. Everyone's favorite program during the pandemic, Netflix got a score of 47. So everyone has a lot of work to do in this space, but you can tell that agencies' efforts in this area are making a difference. Let's dig into a bit deeper into why riders might be feeling the way they are. I'm going to turn it back over to David to continue to explore the results with a focus on what riders think about masks, safety, and the risks of riding public transit.
Before I do, I just want to remind everybody to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in order to ask questions. So the good news on masks, everyone says that they wear masks on transit. We asked, do you wear a mask on transit? Or do you plan on wearing a mask the next time you ride? 99% of people across all demographics said yes. That 1% is disproportionately located in the central south and mountain regions of the US, but the rate's so low it's insignificant. Respondents were also asked to agree on a scale of 1 to 5 with the statement, I would ride public transit more often if my agency could enforce the use of masks. 66% of respondents responded with a 4 or 5, 23% neutral, 11% disagreed. So 99% wear masks, but 66 would ride more if more people wore masks. This is known in the scientific literature as the Lake Wobegon effect. There are a couple of ways of interpreting this. We either have amazing riders, which would mean that the way to get people to wear masks is to have them use our app. I really like that idea, but I guess there's some social truth in the social pressure that in asking the question, people say yes to it. Unfortunately, wouldn't go to the bank that we are the solution to the perception issue there. I think the real answer here is that public transit has a perception problem, and I'll circle back to that in a moment. Delving into the question a little bit more of safety, we know that agencies have all taken extraordinary measures to keep their riders safe, and those measures have changed throughout the pandemic. We've learned lots about what is and isn't dangerous and what works and what doesn't. Across the board, we do not see huge regional variations in rider satisfaction with agency measures. What we do see is it's similar to some of the other measures. Large agencies had a lower mean satisfaction rating, which was in this case 3.55 in the pandemic for pandemic safety than smaller agencies, which was 3.8, that was statistically significant. One thing to note, larger agencies often do have bus and rail systems to contend with, and that those subway and rail systems have been hit particularly dramatically by ridership losses, as well as having received significant negative press, especially at the outset of the pandemic, their cause in spreading it. And here we can see the numbers are reflected in the chart. Some of the lowest performing agencies, for example, the MTA, are also the largest. But moving on to the science, we're curious to understand how riders perceive the risk of contracting COVID-19 on public transit. So we asked the question, check all that apply, where do you feel at greater risk of contracting COVID-19 compared to riding public transit? So a note here, from the science that we've looked at, the right answer is likely all of these. That is, all of these are likely to be somewhat or have higher risk factors than riding public transit. Depends on safety measures, but these activities all take place where more contact is had with more people over a longer time period in a less well-ventilated area than the research. So in theory, all of these should say 100% if that's correct. A surprising 16% actually said that public transit is riskier than all of the given activities. And almost everyone said that public transportation was riskier than at least one, if not more. So it's a substantial fraction of riders who feel safer at a larger indoor gathering than on public transit. Fewer than half of the respondents thought that the gym was riskier than riding public transit. Regionally, people in New England were the most likely to think that large gatherings were more risky, while people in the South Atlantic region were the least likely. The point here is I think this helps us square the circle. Transit has a perception problem. People who ride wear masks, but they're worried that anyone can hop on at any point and not be wearing a mask. And because drivers have to drive, their operators have to operate the vehicles, enforcement can be difficult, even as many agencies have gotten very creative about how to do so. The net result is that riders feel less safe on public transit than they do with other riskier activities. We need to counteract this perception with strong action, or else it will continue to eat into the recovery from the pandemic. And that's my cue to turn it back over to Andrew to talk about the policy in the Biden era. Before I do, a reminder, please submit questions in the Q&A section so that we can see how smart you are. And with that, Andrew.
Thanks, David. So yeah, I think we are going to go through 5 recommendations that we've got. I think obviously at this moment in time, there are lots of different people putting out recommendations around transportation policy. And we want to take some time to highlight some of the ideas we think are well set up to both help with the urgent problems that the survey David and Emily just presented identify, but also use the moment in time we're in to set the stage, as the Biden administration has talked about, for building back better when it comes to public transportation. So on masks, we had a good segue from what David was just closing out on, that there is still a perception problem, even if we think compliance is relatively high among transit users. So the first thing to note, we've already got new leadership at the top, at the federal level, and I think the executive order that was signed almost immediately upon taking office by President Biden set the tone that any interstate travel facility, whether it's an airport or a train, is going to require masks from now on. That's great. That's obviously a change. I think that helps send the message all the way down to local agencies that this is the new tone in Washington. So we think, like David mentioned, that aggressive enforcement at the local level can be tough. A lot of agencies have already come forward and put out mask requirements, as we see here. So there may be other ways to kind of reinforce the messaging that people are using masks to help combat the perception challenge that David talked about. So we think about creative opportunities to use carrots for masks. That can be as basic as making sure that masks are obviously available to use if you don't have one, disposable masks available on buses or other facilities. We could think about community engagement to help people understand the use of masks on transit. So I think leaning into the carrot messaging and practice may be the more important piece of what transit agencies can do, given the other stuff that's already in place. Which is actually a good segue to our next point, because initiatives like that might take additional funds. And funding is obviously where our next recommendation is. As with many other people, funding is obviously crucial given the ridership gaps that we talked about over the last year. And so we think, as do others, that it's an ideal time to break down the so-called 80-20 split that's been in place since I was born in 1982. So we've had 80% of federal funding going to roads and only 20% to transit. That was a win when it was created in 1982. for transit advocates, but it's clearly out of date now. And so we think this is an opportunity to flip that on its head and allocate the majority of federal funding to transit, certainly in the short term. And in addition to more money, being more flexible about how it's used. So in the past, for larger agencies, as many of the people on the call know, you weren't able to use that funding for operating expenses. This all seemed like a pretty heavy lift until last year. And if you were paying attention to the CARES Act, which is one of the stimulus measures that was passed in 2020, what you saw was that transit was allocated $25 billion and that money was flexible and being able to be used for operating expenses. And that $25 billion is more than transit typically gets in an entire year from the federal program. So that's a big step forward. And we think now is the time to kind of solidify and make permanent some of those changes to allow transit to use the money at its disposal as it sees fit to dig itself out of the hole and build for the future. If we go to the next slide. I think, some of the longer term measures, we talked about not just wanting to solve the immediate crisis, but set the stage for a bigger, bolder transit agenda in the future. And we want to join others in calling for a change in how we measure priorities at the federal level. So for a long time, certainly for the last 70 years in the United States, a huge priority has been measuring road speeds as kind of the be all and end all metric of transportation policy. And when you do that, and you think about things like level of service, what you get is a focus on highway capacity expansion. And with the changes in commute patterns we're seeing and a desire for a different mobility system in the future, we think now is an ideal time to shift some of those metrics from road speed and congestion to broader measures like accessibility. And in the past, that was hard to do. Measuring the number of jobs you could reach by transit or by bike or by car was a difficult data problem, but there are an increasing number of tools, including apps like ours, but many others, that make that easier to do. And so we're including a shot here from the University of Minnesota. It's a great set of tools I encourage anyone to check out. But you can now measure this relatively easy. And we think that the US DOT could take step forwards to implement measures that actually measure accessibility broadly across metropolitan areas and lay the groundwork for measuring changes over time. And in addition to accessibility, we think measuring things like greenhouse gas emissions and road safety, and actually setting meaningful targets to reduce those things, not just measuring them, are really powerful parts of the transport agenda going forward that are going to help cities and transit agencies thrive. So next slide. Obviously, one that's near and dear to our heart as a technology company is technology. And anybody on this call knows that over the last 10 years, there's been a wave of new mobility technology that's come onto the scene, which we're excited about. But I think one of the really key priorities we want to see is that public transportation is at the absolute heart of that new urban mobility ecosystem. We've actually seen a lot of amazing work happen in the most difficult circumstances possible during COVID. We've seen agencies procure things like mobile ticketing in a matter of weeks instead of months or even years in the past. We've seen new launches like real-time crowding information, microtransit services, all have come out in the midst of the COVID pandemic. And so we want to see is really leaning into that in the future and having the federal government set up transit agencies to be a real leader in the middle of this mobility system. And then they can do that obviously through funding, but also things like data standard, interoperability, and pieces like that can avoid individual vendor lock-in and help ensure that we have a strong urban mobility system that benefits transit and other modes over time. So we're really excited about what that future agenda says and what we've already seen, frankly, during the COVID period. And last, but certainly not least, I think one of the most exciting things that people in urban transport have seized on as a positive part of the COVID pandemic has been tactical changes in roadway space allocation away from cars and towards things like bikes and pedestrians. And we've seen kind of amazing impact from relatively light touch changes to the urban fabric. And so now that we're thinking about coming out of the pandemic, there's an opportunity to lean into those kinds of changes and make really more meaningful and substantive investments in changing how some of our street space and how our urban infrastructure is used overall. So one of the things we're advocating for and joining other advocates in making this call is thinking about seriously considering highway teardown funding. And this might have seemed a little bit pie in the sky a few months or even years ago, but as of right now, there is a Senate bill circulating that has $10 billion allocated towards highway teardowns, particularly in minority, low-income, and tribal communities, where we know the legacy of our transportation system has left some of its worst and long-lived effects of the transportation system. So we think there's a real opportunity to take the small-scale exciting lessons we've seen from COVID and actually make that an infrastructure program going forward to undo some of the damage of the way we've planned infrastructure over the last 70 years. And with that, I think I'm going to hand back to David to take us into questions.
One of us had to do it, start talking, not on mute. So thanks. There's tons of stuff to fix. The reported list of hires, nominees at the DOT give me a lot of hope for the future. So I think that that's one piece of good news. So let's move it over to my favorite part of this, the questions and answers. As a reminder, if you've got questions, we've got answers. Put them down in the Q&A section. I'll play MC and push questions along to folks as needed. And just a reminder about the Q&A section, but if you're shy or you want to get in touch with us for longer conversation, use our email addresses at the bottom of the screen. So let's start off with some basic background. So Antoine asks, is this US only? And did you survey lapsed riders or did you focus on active riders? Emily, do you want to take a little bit of that? I can also add to it if you want.
Sure. So we did survey across the US and Canada, getting results from all places. You'll notice that we did include a couple of Canadian agencies in some of the charts. The high level stats are US based, but we have all of the Canadian data as well. So we're happy to share some more Canada going forward. We had about 8 to 10% of responses from lapsed users during this November survey. We had a much higher percentage of lapsed users responding to our April survey.
Great, thanks, Emily. Let me also ask you a little bit about the car data set that you mentioned. So Matthew asks, with the car question, does the data set allow correlating responses between April and November to see whether people actually obtained cars as opposed to just, who's riding?
Yeah, absolutely. So although the vast majority of the survey takers in both surveys were not overlapping, we had a sizable chunk, about 600 people who responded to both surveys. And from there, we had the top level results, the ones that were shown on the slide, are from everyone who responded to the survey, which includes all of the dentists and lawyers who may currently be riding in November, who were not riding in April. But also we saw an increase in car ownership amongst those who responded to both surveys directly as well, although it was not as stark.
And one more on some sort of data background here. Ananya asks whether the data was weighted to each agency's ridership, I guess specifically around some of the larger national numbers that we reported.
I think the answer is
I can
no.
answer the question,
Thanks,
which
David.
is no. You're welcome. Yeah, so the answer is no. For the large numbers, it's indicative, but one of the reasons that we don't weight in that way is, and this relates to some of the data that we shared with the dashboard and the ridership tool that we built with APTA, which is that while we have general ideas of what ridership would be, we don't actually know in this day and age what ridership is in November during when this survey was taken. Let's go to one that is for Andrew so that he doesn't feel left out. So Cody asks, and Emily, you can contribute as well. Cody asks, sounds like transit agencies need to become science writers, which is a specialized skill in journalism. Any ideas on how agencies can learn to communicate about the science better in plain language relevant to their community? And I would add, Andrew, are there things that the federal level can do, because that's obviously a very difficult thing to do on an individual basis to help out with that?
Science writers because of mask perception?
Yeah, the perception of safety, I'm assuming, as well as that public transit is perceived as less safe than these other activities, even though the science says that it's more safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a hard issue. I think we talked about some of the obvious ones that we're seeing relatively good mask compliance from our users, and I know there's one question in the chat from a BART operator who has 90+% mask compliance. So in some ways, it may go back to the traditional getting the message out in ways that we can through whatever campaigns are possible to just share the kind of reality of what's happening on transit. But as you talked about, David, I think maybe some physical places that we can reinforce the messaging, whether that means making sure that if only visually, masks are available for taking from people who get on a bus or get on a subway. I think small light touch things that continue to convey, essentially how well the mask compliance is doing on transit, that will help. In terms of convincing people it's more safe than an indoor gathering, which we know is true. I think there are probably more creative people from the marketing world who know how best to do that. I think finding at the federal level support to help that, because I think we're combating a marketing problem and a perception problem. So are there ways that campaigns can be developed to kind of get that message out there? But maybe Emily or David, you guys have some smart ideas too.
Talk to the person who manages Twitter at BART, put out a couple of cutesy tweets. Maybe Gritty in a mask is gonna convince people that that's the way forward. This is why I'm not in marketing at a transit agency.
Well, why don't I ask you a question that you can answer, Emily? Can you talk about how the NPS scores in November improved or declined since April and pre-COVID?
If only I had them in April. We over the course of the pandemic realized that we were very interested in learning more about how agencies were perceived by riders. So we actually do not have information prior to November, but plan on all future surveys, including an NPS rating.
Yeah. I would just add to that one of the things that we're planning on doing is to do this regularly so that we can benchmark over time. I think we all, as much as we believe that good policy can significantly improve the recovery from the pandemic and leave us in a better place than we were, I don't think that there's any misconception that this is going to happen over the course of the next 3 months and everything's going to go back to normal. If you take a look at ridership estimates produced by folks in California or Massachusetts or across the board by local transit agencies, we're looking at a year from now, still with ridership estimates at best at 70% of what they were pre-pandemic. So we've got a long road to go. And I think it's super important that we be able to track this over time to understand what initiatives work and what initiatives don't. Policy question for Andrew, and of course, Emily, if you want to go in. Peter asks that looking at agencies that were less dependent on commuter riders prior to the pandemic, are there any policy recommendations that can not only bring back commuters, but also increase ridership across trip purposes? Agencies like this have lost less ridership, but may have had lower ridership per capita prior to the pandemic. So some of these communities have not recovered or just recently recovered from the 2007 Great Recession when the pandemic hit. So we're talking about lower, traditionally more disadvantaged communities where you don't have commuters and quote unquote choice riders.
Yeah. Well, I think, in some ways, while it traditionally would have been thought of as the harder agency to be, I think we're seeing some potential for that to be a slightly easier position to be in a sense, if you're less dependent on kind of peak hour commute as the main source of ridership. So I think some of our recommendations around that third bucket of making sure that transit agencies are at the center of new mobility, to me, is kind of related to this question, which is to the extent there are new tools being developed that can move people around cities, especially if you're not talking about having to move people at kind of peak hour, subway capacities, there may be more options to move riders, whether that means there are places where, as you build back, microtransit could be an option. We're seeing that in a lot of smaller agencies thinking seriously about more on-demand or kind of semi-on-demand options. We think that could be some way that gets riders back into the system as things go forward. Obviously, that depends on the local context, whether or not it makes sense. But what we think is, if you're going to go down that route of providing new forms of service to people, what you want to make sure is that transit agencies sit at the heart of that, understand what they're asking for, and really importantly, understand how it interacts with and is used in combination with fixed route transit. So, I think like any trip planning app like we are, I think we can provide a service to make sure people understand the service offerings as they exist. But as they change going forward, making sure those things are seen by your riders alongside other options, making sure they're thought of as an integrated whole. I think there's a lot of opportunities there for agencies that are maybe smaller and have less condensed peak hour trips to really take advantage of some of the new technology. We shouldn't chase technology for its own sake, but where there are places that it can be useful, I'd love to see transit kind of in the rider's seat there, the driver's seat, sorry.
One of the places that we've been able to help in that respect is an opportunity to provide a communication channel to these riders. The way in which we solicited 20,000 results over the course of having this survey up for a week or so is the same way that many agencies are working with us now to try to encourage more responses from their ridership, specifically around the measures that they're putting in place. So continuing to reach out through transit and other means that are more safe and more contactless is a good way for agencies to think about learning about what their riders are doing and trying to change their services as a result.
Let's return a little bit to some specific survey questions. So Matthew asks, what other facets of satisfaction did you measure in November besides reliability, COVID-19 safety measures, and overall SAT?
Yeah, there were a couple of specific prompts that we asked people to respond to. I'm just pulling them up now. One of them was same scale, 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I can still get where I need to go on public transit, even if I'm not riding. This one had a little bit of a difference in who was, top of the heap and who was lowest. TriMet did really well on this measure, as well as, shockingly, MTA buses in New York. The MTA, not at the bottom of the heap for this one. Rochester in Rochester, New York also did well. SORTA in Ohio and RIPTA in Rhode Island were the top 5 according to those responses. And the lowest rated agencies were VTA in San Jose, Muni in San Francisco, Detroit, DOT, Kansas City, and unfortunately, as I mentioned, Baltimore had a bit of a struggle across all of the measures on this particular survey. And I'm crying tears inside about how they performed. We had a couple of other prompts. One of them was a use of resources prompt. My agency has done the best they can with the budget and resources available. We were trying to see if people were sentimental and felt like agencies were trying really hard to get results. And what we found was it had similar results to the safety and reliability questions. And then finally, I feel well informed by my agency about route disruptions and changes. This was to get at, a communication tools and how well agencies were using them. This also kind of met in the middle with those other measures of satisfaction. We highlighted during the presentation the ones that were most stark.
Thanks, Emily. And I'll just note that we will be releasing a full report on all of this with many more than the questions that we covered briefly in this webinar relatively shortly. Since most of us are located north of the border as transit, let me do one there. So Aaron asks, in relation to the risks around taking public transit, the Greater Toronto Area Transit Agencies have had an onboard mask mandate in place for a number of months now. Was there a noticeable difference in the responses between the US and Canadian markets to that question? And I'm looking to Emily, I think, for that one.
The answer is I do not know, but I hope I can get an answer to that and include it in the report that we're going to be going live with. But I imagine that it would have an impact. One of the things we did notice about the TTC in particular was that it didn't do particularly well on the NPS. So in spite of the fact that there is mask enforcement, I could imagine general reasonable dissatisfaction with that agency in particular. But as I mentioned, you know, there are other agencies, Hamilton, et cetera, that have different NPS scores. And I'd be happy to talk more with you about those results, but I don't have them at the moment.
One more for you there, Emily. Janice asks, you mentioned that a majority of respondents to the November survey were white. Thoughts on future surveys on how to diversify your respondent pool? I think this is a more common challenge than we think. Janice, absolutely, it's a more common challenge than you think. But if we take a look at the data, we've actually found that, and Emily can follow up with numbers, that I think our surveys luckily don't succumb to that issue. In fact, that the pool of riders that we end up surveying is representative as per APTA surveys. In fact, often we find that we have more Black and brown respondents than white respondents versus the proportion of ridership in the system. A large reason for this is because we tend to, the people who use transit, our app, the transit app the most tend to be bus riders who have had the burden of having the worst service, and often tend to be more likely to be low income or non-white. And so that's also where the app tends to be more useful on bus service. And so we actually tend to have a quote unquote too diverse pool, which we think is a really positive thing, and fights against what you, as you noted, is one of the more common challenges in surveying riders.
Yes, well, we actually found in this most recent survey that of respondents, about 35% of them were white, which was the largest of the subgroups. And that differed from the April survey in that about 24% of respondents were white in the April survey. According to an APTA report that came out in 2017, 39% of all transit riders are white. So we are approaching that with our November survey responses. But or interestingly, the number of Black respondents we received in this most recent survey is 28%. And according to the 2017 report, 24% of riders were Black. So we are not seeing a disproportionate number of respondents from white respondents as part of this November survey. It was just significantly different than the drop in white respondents in April.
Andrew, so you don't fall asleep, let me throw you one here. Lisa asks, here are two newbie questions, which I disagree with, but they're good questions. Can we talk about job creation with an expansion of the budget dedicated to public transit versus road construction? And do we have any data to estimate the number of jobs?
I don't know the tip of my fingers, but I know that from almost all the evidence that's ever been presented that I've seen from lots of advocates who are deep in the weeds, the number of jobs created from a public dollar spent on transit is dramatically higher than roadway spending. So I think in the midst of the pandemic, that just adds to the arguments we already had out there. So we could dig one out for you. I know there's been lots of good economic studies on the trickle-down impact of jobs from transit spending, but everything I've ever seen indicates multiples higher than spending on road construction. So I think you're listing just another solid argument in favor of flipping some of that spending priorities in the moment that we're in. Is there more to the question? Sorry, that was my first.
Yeah, I think you did good.
Yeah.
I've got one that's totally self-serving here from Anonymous. So what kind of app features have Transit's government partners been asking Transit to add to help their riders? And Emily, I can let you take that one.
I am so sorry. I was trying to review the other questions. Could you repeat the question?
Why don't I answer this one then? Thanks, Emily. we can talk about crowding, which is one of the features that we've added across the board. We can talk about things like allowing this more continuous feedback, allowing riders to talk directly about what their rides are. We've received some things that we think aren't as useful either. Things like, when was the last time a vehicle was cleaned, putting that up there. But I think, you know, and a ton of features around contactless ticketing in particular, which we've rolled out with, you know, more than a dozen cities with a whole variety of partners over the course of the last 6 to 9 months, simply because it becomes quite popular. Anything you want to add to that?
One thing that
Emily?
yes, thank you, David. One thing that to add to that we are currently working on and are updating is our messaging in our step-by-step navigational guide Go, which we are updating to remind people about mask wearing and compliance with mask wearing. That is a part of the future of thinking about how we respond to trips. We have pursued a number of opportunities that involve the concept of rating a ride or providing additional information about a particular trip to transit agencies in the hopes of getting more rider feedback in the moment. Agencies have been asking for functionality similar to that, as well as expanding on our communications tools and our ability to solicit more feedback in a variety of places throughout the application.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
On the features that are being asked for, I feel like either as a result of the pandemic or just timing wise, it feels like there's a big increase in the number of on-demand microtransit contracts that are happening. And so one of the things we're seeing is that, you know, the past history of those programs, there's been some cases of people not necessarily knowing how to find access to those services and the ridership being disappointing in some cases. And so one of the things we're being asked to do is, you know, how can we integrate into transit app alongside fixed route transit, things like microtransit and on-demand, as more and more of those programs roll out. So I feel like that's been a growing, you know, request from some partners we have across the country.
Absolutely. So we're running up on time, so I'm going to have 2 more questions for the lightning round. The first one is going to be directed mostly towards Andrew, but all of us can answer, those playing along at home. So what do you think is the role of the media in helping combat the public transit perception problem? We've moved from transit is death spiraling to will work from home kill transit in the headlines almost on a dime. This is very well written. I like this question. Yeah. Clickbait will sadly always rule, but there seems to be a barrier between what agencies can communicate and what the mainstream narrative is. Whoever anonymous is, fantastic question.
They shouldn't be anonymous. Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like you're very right. I mean, everybody is, it seems everybody, by everybody, I mean everybody in the sort of media outlets that a lot of us consume are quite ready to say transit is dying for XYZ reason. And it's obviously clear that you know, there is a hole in transit ridership that we're seeing, but that's very far from being a long-term indictment of how transit looks in the future. So, you know, I think there's lots of answers to your question. I think from our particular transit perspective, I mean, one of the things that I see, and I used to work, as David mentioned, at a tech company that got a lot of press, you know, sometimes for things that probably didn't merit the level of attention that they got. And so I think making sure that we continue to promote transit agencies as leaders in this future of transportation. So, you know, a lot of times people frame, you know, new technology, you know, mobile apps, et cetera, as somehow, you know, obviating the need for transit. And we think rather they help to strengthen the argument for transit. So when I say I want to see transit at the center of the new mobility ecosystem, that's partially a reality of, you know, the operational efficiency and the gains in ridership that will come from that. But I also think as a perception thing, if we can make sure people understand how vital public transit is to ensuring that all this new tech we're seeing actually goes in the right direction, to me, that can help in one small way, at least shift the perception that so many people seem to have that transit is kind of an old thing and there's some new stuff like flying vehicles that are coming that's going to make it unnecessary. So, you know, there are obviously some outlets that are more careful. You know, the city labs in the US context, I think, take an extra second to write a deeper story about transit. But at least from the transit app perspective, I think making sure that we highlight how much transit has been a genuine leader in the mobility ecosystem, starting all the way back with things like GTFS and going further than that, to make sure people understand that this is part of the future and not something that's, shifting over time. So that's what I think is important, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, just to add one more thing to that, which is, I worked for a number of years on the transit agency side before joining transit, and press perception kills. Whatever you do at a transit agency tends to be perceived relatively negatively, and then someone does it outside and it's perceived positively. And that really hurts when you're inside a transit agency, and some of it is general anti-government sentiment, and that's a larger sort of nihilism in our society that I don't think transit agencies can necessarily fight on their own. But the other part of it is the extent to which the service offered is not up to what people expect it to be. And so people really want to get from A to B, and sometimes it doesn't work. And ultimately, I think a lot of this comes down to how we're willing to fund agencies in creative ways in order to make sure that they can provide the service that people need. It is a press problem, there is a perception problem, there are all of these things. But it is also, I think, largely a funding issue and a service on the road issue. And if the service is better, the perception changes significantly. So wrapping up, I think that was a great question to wrap up on the policy side and the what's next. Jean asks, on the sort of more practical side, is it possible to get an extract of one particular agency or a regional extract? The answer is yes, absolutely, 100%. Please just get in touch with us at the email addresses that are listed below. We do communicate outside of webinars, so any one of those email addresses will do. And that's one of the things that we think is really exciting about what we've done. We've had fun here talking about the national results and the implications, and we think that those are interesting. But I think that as we really dig down into the regional level and you're able to look at this on a continuous basis is where the power of this large sample national database of perceptions of transit agency service and safety, et cetera, is really going to bear fruit. So with that, thank you, Emily. Thank you, Andrew, for joining me. Thank you to the little elves in the background who made this run off smoothly. And thanks to all of you for showing up. And bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.